Morning, everybody. Today I'll be reading from Luke chapter 19, verse 28 to 48. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' say, 'The Lord needs it.'" Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." When Jesus entered the temple courts, he began to drive out those who were selling. "It is written," he said to them, "My house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find any way to do it, because all the people hung on his words.
Can't decide if the season of Easter has the best marketing or the worst marketing around it. It's a bit of a confused season. I'm from the U.S. This sort of time of year, these transition times of year are confusing for me. Lent is the time of preparation for Easter and on the church calendar. Lent means spring, which it is not. This week we turned to autumn here, so that's a little strange for me. Easter comes from an old Germanic goddess or something like that, so it's named after this sort of, the medieval church was always sort of changing things around, so it's named after a medieval goddess, which Easter has nothing to do with. The thing we do is have a hide and seek with lollies on Easter, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Chocolate that we put in the shape of eggs for some reason. Eggs, chocolate eggs. And the mascot of Easter is a rabbit, which has nothing to do with chocolate or eggs, but it's a rabbit is sort of the poster, that's the mascot. We have Good Friday, which is not good. And then today we have the triumphant entry, which, as we just heard, it's not so triumphant. Sort of a confusing time of year. What is the tension in your life right now? What's the thing you sort of spend the most time going back and forth on in your head? It's different than asking you, what's the most painful thing or difficult thing in your life. That's probably something that exists as well, but attention is something that you're wrestling with, that you're thinking through. You want to live in Sydney, but can you afford it? Should affordability dictate all your decisions? You need to pay the bills, but the job that you have to pay the bills is crushing you. But it's paying the bills, and you don't have another choice. Do you stay in it? Is that what God wants for you? Are you supposed to just faithfully plod through this, or is God telling you to do something else? Maybe you desperately long to have a partner or to be a parent, and neither of those things are happening. Is it a desire of your heart that God promises He will give you, or is this something that's not going to happen? What purpose do I have in my retirement? Am I doing enough with my time? Am I investing myself in the right places? I think to be human is to live in those tensions. Like it's faithful to experience those tensions. Luke's telling of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem is particularly tension-filled. Did you notice some of the things that don't happen in Luke's story? Did you notice there's no palms? There's no palms in Luke's telling of the story. There's no shout of Hosanna. So that whole bit where we grabbed palms and walked around and shouted Hosanna, yeah, I mean, not in our text. In other story, in other parts of in other Gospels, we have those details, but not in ours today. Luke seems to really intentionally be leaving some of the sort of signs of triumph, the triumphalism. He's sort of leaving those details aside. His story of this moment in Jesus' ministry is filled with tensions. In our story today, we see Jesus sort of in this joyful moment of reverie and celebration, but it transitions quickly to this moment where Jesus weeps. And it's the only point in Luke's gospel, the second point in the Bible where Jesus cries as he sees Jerusalem. And then, of course, this sort of grief turns into anger. Jesus is in tension. I just want to look at two of these tensions. The first is the tension between Jesus' kingship and worldly kingship. In this moment, Jesus, so he's been making his way to Jerusalem for a long time. Jerusalem's an important city in Luke's gospel. Luke's gospel begins with Zechariah in the temple. And the very last verse of Luke is the disciples went to the temple every day and were praising and worshiping God. We begin and we end in the temple. The temple's incredibly important. Jesus is making his way there. And on his way there, he really obviously uses some of the human signals we have to indicate, I am a king. I am coming to reign. And yet, he shifts the grammar of power so dramatically that we're sort of left saying, but are you? Is that really what you're up to here? The first sign is the colt that he rides on. This little pony that Jesus rides on into Jerusalem. It's almost comical when you think about it. Jesus has been traveling for 100 kilometers. He's been making his way from Galilee. Luke's had us on this journey with him for a very long time. And so he's made the journey all the way to Bethany and Bethphage, we're told, which is like, I mean, he's so close to Jerusalem. You can see the city gate. It's just down the hill where he decides all of a sudden, after 99% of this journey, where he's walked the entire time. He's walked, that's how he gets around. But now at this moment, he decides to tell his disciples, you know what? For this last little bit, go get me a colt. Go get me a donkey. And it's such an odd and peculiar thing to do that it can only mean one thing. It can only mean that he is announcing his reign. The disciples know immediately what he's doing. The Pharisees know immediately what Jesus is doing. By telling them to go get a donkey, a colt, a foal, he is directly referencing Zechariah 9, which is would have been a well-known messianic text for the disciples, for his followers. Zechariah writes, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So when Jesus stops his disciples and says, you know what? For this last little bit, let's go get the donkey. His disciples are like, all right, come on, let's do it. They're pumped, they're excited, they go get the donkey, and it's sort of a strange detail for us, but for them, I think the meaning is quite obvious. Okay, they've been begging Jesus, let's take the city. Well, we're equipped. We got our swords ready to go. Let's ride into Jerusalem and take the throne. You've got the will of the people behind you. The revolt it's time now. So Jesus does this very obvious thing that the Messiah would do. All right. And of course, the flip side is that it's a donkey. And wouldn't you want to ride on something more majestic if you were truly going to ride in with an army behind you to take over the city? But the disciples go get the donkey. They throw their cloaks on it. They sort of make a red carpet with their cloaks. Again, there's no signs of the palm branches in Luke, so we'll leave that to be. He goes and rides on the colt. And then it says, when he came to the place where the road goes down, he begins his descent into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. This is the journey he would have taken quite regularly from Bethany and Bethphage. This is where his friends lived, and he spent time at the descent of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built on a hillside. And there's the temple on the east side of the wall, and on the northern side there's Herod's palace. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Thanks, Lily. Here's an image of where Jesus would have come down. So right here at the bottom corner, that's the gate he would have gone down. This is sort of a recreation of the city in the first century. And the Mount of Olives is just up here on the right side here. And so he descends through a gate called the Dung Gate. And it is called the Dung Gate because the sewage and stormwater of all of Jerusalem would have flowed right past this gate. The runoff from all of the activities at the temple, all of it would have flown through the southeast part of the city. This is the poor part of the city. This is not the upper west side. There was a large gate called the Magnificent Gate, which is up top there in the middle. And you see even the nicer roofs with the red roofs, sort of the houses that were wealthy that could afford the nice roofs. Herod and Pilate would have entered Jerusalem for Passover. Perhaps this happens on the same day. We don't know if it happens on the same day, but they would have entered from the west because they had holiday houses on the water in Caesarea Maritima, and they would have made their trip to Jerusalem on a much nicer road, entering through the Magnificent Gate. And their procession would have had some of the same hallmarks as Jesus, a crowd perhaps around them, though they would have had the standards of the Roman Empire and guards and shields. Jesus enters on the lower east side, and it's not an accident. He makes this entry on purpose. It reminds me of a church in a slum called Kalerwe, which was in Kampala. I studied in Uganda with my wife, and I studied in Uganda when we were in university. And I wanted to study somewhere where I could work with a church that was very different from my church growing up in the Midwest of the United States. So I got to intern with the Anglican Church in Kampala, and I was assigned to work with a man named Reverend Frederick, who was the pastor of St. James Church in a slum called Kalerwe. And Reverend Frederick had just been reassigned to this congregation, this parish, from a more affluent parish. And I could tell in just my interactions with him that he was still trying to wrap his head around what it meant to pastor St. James Church in one of the slums of Kampala. The Global Development Fund had recently, in the past year, completed a brand new highway that had cut off all the drainage for Kalerwe, which again sat at the bottom of 3 different hills. And so multiple times a year, Kalerwe would flood with water up to 1 meter high that would just sit in the slum. And there had been deaths, cholera and malaria. Those deaths had spiked as a result of the highway being built and the drainage being cut off. So multiple times a year it would flood, and every time it did flood, St. James Church sunk a little bit lower into the ground, so that when I was following him around and just touring around the church site, to enter the church building, you you had to basically, imagine that this door had gone down so that there was only this much, and you had to step through a window like this to get in. You stepped over the frame of the window because the whole church building had sunk down into the ground. There were a few plastic chairs and an electric keyboard and a young guy who chose the different beats to sing along with, and a few dozen women from Kalerwe who brought a few more dozen children along with them to the sunken church. And after spending a week or so with Reverend Frederick, he asked me if I would preach. And so I, yeah, sure, I'll preach. And I remember the worship, the women singing and dancing, the prayers. And I remember having the realization, what in the world? I'm 21, 21-year-old kid from Michigan. What am I going to tell these women about the God that they are pouring themselves out to? The God that they know more intimately than maybe I ever will. And the truth is, I would probably be much more confident preaching in a room full of pastors and professors and the Bishop of Canterbury than I was standing up there preaching to these faithful women who had arrived at church for some hope that day. Because if there are seats of honor in the heavenly places, I am sure they are reserved for beautiful people like them who receive no reward in this life. And the scene on the Lower East Side of Jerusalem is not so different. It's comical and it's backwards. It's coats and branches, not crimson standards and polished shields. It's the foal of a donkey. And Jesus' feet scrape the ground as the donkey struggles through the dung gate. It's not the 2-meter-tall war horse emblazoned with the insignia of war. And there are no kingmakers present as Jesus enters into Jerusalem. One of the common storylines about Palm Sunday is that the crowd which shouts, Hosanna on Sunday, shouts, crucify him on Friday. And there's probably some truth to that. By the end of the week, maybe even some of these people who were shouting Hosanna had been let down and had changed their minds. But I think if you took a head count, if you did a roll call of people who were there on Palm Sunday shouting Hosanna, I don't think there would be a whole lot of overlap between the crowds. Because the people on the Lower East Side, they weren't allowed in the chief priest's house where Jesus' trial was started. They weren't allowed to enter into Herod's palace on the Upper West Side where Pontius Pilate would have finally handed Jesus over. I'm not sure how much overlap there is. The crowd here making their way from Jericho and Bethany it's Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and he still has the stench of the grave clothes on him because just a few days earlier he was in a tomb. And it's the blind beggar who's still sort of getting used to what it means to live with light. It's the tax collector who's handing out denarii to the people he recognizes that he has defrauded. It's the woman with the vaginal bleeding who Jesus touched and healed, and the prostitute who gave up everything to follow Jesus. Every person has a story to tell. That's what Luke says. He says they were all shouting for the deeds of power that they had seen Jesus do. It's the drunk and the gambler and the sinner. It's the children of the women whose houses flood every time it rains because no one cares enough to do anything about it. These are the people who shout, "Glory in the highest. Blessed is this King who comes in the name of the Lord." And the Pharisees say to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out." Jesus' kingship is not of this world. It is in tension with everything we know about what power and sovereignty look like. This is a tension we ought to experience in our own lives. those of us who call Jesus Lord, who follow the Savior on a donkey with tears stained on his cheeks, we ought to experience this tension. If we don't ever feel the tension of God's kingdom rubbing against the kingdom of this world in which we live, something's gone wrong for us. It ought to feel like we're living with a foot in two worlds. Has it felt that way at all for you this year? Christians must be bilingual. What I mean by that is we must learn to speak the language of the kingdom even as we are surrounded every day by the language of the world. And that's partly what we do when we come together on Sundays and we gather, is we learn the grammar of the kingdom. We remind ourselves of the language of God's kingdom that we take into the kingdom of the world. The language of the kingdom sounds like, blessed are the poor. Right? If we don't come together to learn how to speak that language, we will forget how to speak it. Because the language of the world certainly doesn't say that. The language of the world sounds like, blessed are the wealthy, and the wealthier you get, the more blessed you are. The language of the kingdom sounds like, blessed are the meek and the peacemakers. The fruit of the Spirit is gentleness and kindness. Man, that's a different language than the language of the world. And so we come together to learn that grammar, to remind ourselves that this is the orienting story. This is the language we speak. And I'll tell you this, if the only time you're practicing this language is twice a month for an hour and a half, then you will not learn to speak the language very well, right? We need to remind each other of how to speak the language of the kingdom. Yes, we gather every Sunday. We need to remind ourselves daily that we speak a different language. Have you experienced the tension of living in these two worlds, the tension that Jesus' kingship brings into the kingship of the world? Has your diary felt this tension? Have your finances felt this tension? So there's a tension with the nature of Jesus' kingship. And then the second tension is the rejection of that kingship, right? Jesus turns the corner, ducks under the bough of an olive tree, and sees the temple, and he begins to weep. You know, and if I were in his situation, it would be sort of tears for myself, maybe knowing about what was going to happen to me. But Jesus' tears are tears for the city, tears for the people and the place that he loves. Not his own fate, but the fate if he knows what will happen to Jerusalem. Jesus comes to reign in a city that will not have him. He says, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. And he says these prophetic words then, the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. As Jesus descends into Jerusalem, he sees the temple. Let's put that image up one more time, Lily. We see the image of the temple on the one side, and then, yeah, good, that's good. And then across the way, you can see Herod's palace. That's Herod's palace. It's the second most important building in Jerusalem. It's opposite of the temple on the upper side. That's where Pilate would have stayed, where Jesus probably would have faced one of his trials. And Herod's palace was built by Herod the Great about 30 or 40 years earlier. It had three immense towers that go up. Each of them have names. I forget what they were. Porticos, gardens, two courtyards that could host 100 people in each so that Herod could throw his parties, 2 rooms for entertaining. Josephus describes the palace as having such large and incredible blocks laid that it looks almost as if it's one single stone structure carved out of it, even though it's blocks laid on top of each other. In 66 AD, the Roman governor at the time, Gessius Florus, would oversee a mass crucifixion of Jews. And that would be followed in 70 AD by the entire city being sacked by Rome, sieged and sacked. And it's at this point that these towers are burned and then destroyed. Jerusalem rejects Jesus, and in this moment, Jesus draws a direct parallel from their rejection of him to what would happen. And Jerusalem's rejection of Jesus is representative, of course, of every city of the world rejecting Jesus, but here, Jesus draws a direct parallel to what's to come. When the Creator came to its creation, we crucified him. Jesus, the embodiment of self-giving love, came to the world with an invitation to peace and shalom, and we violently killed him. I think the question of suffering in the world is such a important and fraught question. It's hard to answer, but I think part of the answer starts here, that when the Creator came, we crucified him. When Jesus comes to Jerusalem to offer to be its King of Peace, it rejects his offer. Jesus knows that Jerusalem will reject him, and he rides into the city anyways. He came to that which was his own, John writes, but his own did not receive him. You do not ride into a city as a sign of resignation. Why does he ride to his death? Is Jesus truly king of a world that rejected him and constantly chooses to reject him? This is a tension I feel every Sunday morning when we gather to sing, and we sing, "There's joy in the house of the Lord." When I know that for many of us, joy is not what we are bringing. We sing, God has done great things. We sing that God reigns, but we do so knowing that, famine has been declared in Sudan, and there's a new war raging. And the brothers and sisters that we prayed for when Layla was here with Open Doors, got an update, they've been arrested. And in our own lives, the tensions we feel, Jesus' reign doesn't seem to be producing the kind of results that I hoped it would. We still have unmet longings, and the desires of our heart still seem to be unmet. Jesus is the great physician, but I haven't experienced healing. Jesus rides into a city that will reject him. He gives us himself. We begin with Jesus joyfully and defiantly marching into the city, and then we turn to see that joy become grief as Jesus sees the city that rejects him. And finally, we see that grief transform into a righteous anger as Jesus reaches the end of this journey, and he arrives at the temple, and he clears the temple. And what was a bustling courtyard of commerce, charging people for their prayers and cheating people of their offerings, the temple is emptied out, cleared. Everything is removed. Anything that might have hindered people from worshiping God, every obstacle is literally thrown out by Jesus. And then Luke ends this section with Jesus standing there in this empty temple teaching, and the people hang on every word that he says. Joy, grief, anger. This story holds all of that, and it prepares us well for Good Friday this week. Later in this week, there will be another procession, and this one will happen much along the same road. And there will be Roman guards and Jewish leaders, and there will be some of the Palm Sunday crowd mixed in. Jesus will be at the front of this procession again, but this time, instead of riding on a donkey, he'll be carrying a cross. And he will be crowned with thorns and given a robe in mockery, and a sign above his head will proclaim in jest the truth that he is the king. This is the tension. There's no country, no city, and no person that Jesus doesn't arrive at with peace to offer. This week, Jesus arrives to bring us peace, to bring you peace. And we should make space for him. This is the most sacred week in our calendar. And I would encourage you to do something different this week. Do something different to set it apart. We don't do great with sort of sacredness or setting different seasons apart. We don't do that so well. But I would encourage you to do something to set this week apart. It's called Holy Week, and it is. It's a sacred time. And I know that school holidays are coming up, and still got work Monday through Thursday. Hopefully you have Friday off. But I would encourage you to do something to clear the temple of your lives of the commerce and the busyness that so often consumes it and makes it really difficult. Maybe that looks like praying at lunch. Maybe that looks like, doing something in the mornings. Maybe there's 4 Gospels. I hope you'll come back Friday and be with us Friday. Maybe Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, take one of the Gospels and read the account of Jesus' suffering, the story that leads up. There's so much in it. And we come to this time of year and try to squeeze it all in on Good Friday. I mean, we talk about it throughout the rest of the year, but there's too much to fit in. So my encouragement to you is, whether you're coming into this week with joy or with grief or anger, whatever that tension is, bring it into this week and do something this week to mark it out as holy and sacred, to prepare your hearts for Friday and then for Easter. So that's my encouragement for this week. Jesus arrives this week, today, into whatever that tension is in your life. He arrives to bring you peace. It's not always not an easy answer, but to bring you real peace. So let's make space to receive him as the King that he is. And let's prepare ourselves for Friday and for Sunday.